Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. And today we're going to share our secrets for homebrewing monsters in your games of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
It just so happens that Monty and I have been hard at work homebrewing a ton of brand new monsters. And so we figured we'd take all of the tips that we've learned and executed recently and share them with you in today's episode. There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
So as Kelly alluded to, we have been working very hard over the past year and a half to cook up a massive book filled with monsters inspired by eldritch horror in the world of Drakenheim. And now that project is coming to life. Monsters of Drakenheim is now live on Kickstarter.
This is going to be our biggest book yet, filled with well over 150 new monsters, but it isn't just a monster book. This monster book is going to come complete with lore and art for all of the amazing monsters that we're designing, as well as tables the characters can roll on to learn about the monsters they're hunting, and different ways that you can build environments and adventures surrounding these monsters. As well, we're introducing new conditions for these monsters to inflict upon their foes, and a new crafting system that is action forward, where you get to kill the monsters, collect their parts, and build cool new unique items to slay more monsters with.
The monsters in the book are inspired by the terrible creatures that inhabit the world of Drakenheim. They include body horror inspired mutant creatures, the creations of mad scientists stitched together with flesh and bone and metal, the alien inhabitants of the space between worlds, and an entire forest full of trolls. Whether you're running games in our world of Drakenheim, such as our Dungeons of Drakenheim adventure, or your own adventures in another world, there's going to be something for you in this book. The Kickstarter is the best chance you've got to get in on this project now, because you'll be able to playtest the monsters along with us when that happens, as well as get all of the amazing cool accessories, miniatures, and much, much more all together in a great big bundle on Kickstarter. So follow the links down below to check out Monsters of Drakenheim while the campaign is alive through April.
So in preparing for this video, we've been working a lot on our own monsters, and even doing that, we had to come up with our own principles and guidelines for what Monty and I were using to create our homebrew monsters that are going to be published in this book. We've also spent time talking to a lot of other people in the industry, not to mention people from the D&D studio team who have their hand in creating amazing monsters themselves. So we've tried to pick up as much as we can. And so let's talk about the steps that we take when we are designing the monsters that we've made. What's important to us when we're designing a monster, how we get it from an idea in our head onto the page, into play at everybody's table.
When Kelly and I sit down to make a monster, our process boils down to 4 steps: evaluating what our goal is, doing our research, going into the development, that's where a lot of the meat of this happens, and then finally doing some playtesting. And with this 4-step process, we've applied this to every monster that we've made in our own books, and it gives us a really useful toolbox for assessing how we might approach more monsters in the future, and hopefully that you can use as well. So starting off, we know you want to make a monster, but being a little bit more precise in what your goal is in making that monster is a really important step in clarifying the entire rest of the process. It's going to give you a direction to go in and help you determine where you want to focus. Not only are there a lot of different types of monsters, such as minions, lackeys, lieutenants, unique boss monsters, rank and file warriors, dragons, demons, undead, everything in between, but there's also a lot of story and a lot of inspiration that you want to really focus in on when you're choosing what you want to make.
When I'm thinking of my goal with a monster, oftentimes it starts with where I'm drawing my inspiration from. For me, myself, a lot of times, if I am watching a movie or reading a book or playing a video game, a lot of these things that I engage with often involve cool monsters. I love horror movies. I love books like the Dresden Files that often have a lot of awesome monsters, recently a lot of fae. But I kind of grab the inspiration from there and say, is there anything kind of like that in D&D? Sometimes the answer is yes, and I can find that if I wanted to make the Blair Witch Project into a monster, well, the Dusk Hag is already there, or the Night Hag. Might be the Night Hag. But sometimes you'll already find what exists. But if you find that you have a cool idea for a monster, you were inspired by something, and it doesn't already exist in D&D, immediately what I will do when I'm finished the movie or when I'm taking a break from the video game is I will quickly jot down in plain speech the cool things that monster did. If I am watching the 1980s The Blob movie, I might write down, okay, well, this thing's a giant blob. It's probably an ooze. It eats everything it touches, dissolves them. Nothing seems to be able to hurt it except cold. And already there, I have the blueprints for what could be a really cool D&D monster, just because I jotted down some ideas. What did the monster do? What was the cool things that it did? How was it defeated? These might give you clues as to some of the design work that you're going to put in later.
Now, maybe you're not working from inspiration from a specific movie, book, or TV show, and instead you're planning your campaign and you know that you need a monster for something. And this is where you need to assess, okay, I want to create a specific challenge for my players. And that's where articulating the challenge that you want to create is really important. It's a different set of design principles if you are designing a monster whose purpose is to be a rank and file minion that you're going to use dozens of, or a deadly beast that the players might encounter in the wilderness, versus an entirely unique boss monster that they're only going to fight in an epic showdown. Understanding, are you making a boss? Are you making a mook? Or something in between is really important to nail down early on in the process, because that's going to change so much of what you're looking for mechanically. And I would recommend that if you're getting started homebrewing monsters, I think that a lot of new dungeon masters like to start homebrewing the big bad evil guy first. And that's not necessarily doing the giant CR30 monster stat block is not where I would start for homebrewing your first monster. And I would personally recommend, if you've never homebrewed a monster before, challenge yourself to create a non-unique monster somewhere between challenge rating 3 and 7. First of all, that's a very monster's been that challenge rating you can use through an entire campaign in a bunch of different ways, and they are often readily adaptable, and they're a great place to start. So you might ask yourself, like, you might have a specific challenge rating in mind, or a specific tactical role that you want to do. Maybe you want to make a spellcasting monster. Maybe you want a monster with range attacks. Maybe you want a monster that's a bit of a tank or a soldier. Or maybe you do have an ability in mind of, like, man, my players just learned to fly, so I need a monster that can challenge them or threaten them now that they can fly. Or maybe you are looking through and you're designing a deadly swamp of eternal sorrows, and you really feel like you need to make something that lives in the swamp of eternal sorrows that's more than just a shambling mound and another green hag and a bunch of other plant monsters that are already in the monster manual.
I find that that's one of the places that I start to explore a lot. Is I run quite a bit of D&D, and I'm going to use the swamp example. I love running swamps, but my players have already faced a froghemoth twice.
Yeah.
They've already faced giant crocodiles and hags and all of the things that you would normally find in a swamp. We've done that. I'm now probably on my 5th or 6th swamp. Is it going to have a black dragon again? Maybe. I don't know. But now's the time where I start to think, okay, well, what else could we find in a swamp that I don't have access to? And that might be a really good point to jump in and say, well, we have the froghemoth. What about the gatorhemoth?
It's not surprising to run out of monsters, because when you think about it, the monster manual has about 300 monsters in it. And if you never fought the same monster twice, you had 4 encounters per game session, it would only take you 75 game sessions to get through the entire monster manual, which feels like a lot, but if you've been playing D&D for a couple of years, which I think a lot of people have, it's really easy to go through that. And oftentimes you use multiple encounters in multiple different ways and you use monsters in different ways. And of course, there's a lot of other great source books out there beyond just the monster manual.
So your goal might be to fill a gap or to create something brand new or to base something off of something you were inspired by. But either way, knowing that goal, jotting down some point form notes at the beginning is going to help you know what you need to do moving into your research.
At the end of your goal phase, you should be able to state, I want to make a monster that is inspired by X. It has some kind of cool ability or is inspired by this book, and I'm looking to build a monster of about challenge rating something whose role is to be a minion, a standard monster, a boss monster. If you could articulate that in 3 to 5 sentences, that's a really good goal. And I like to put that right at the top of my design document and refer back to that over and over and over again.
Lastly, you might want to give your monster a name. Now, one thing that Monty and I have realized is that names change a lot from the point of origin to the point that they're playtesting.
I think we had like crazy squirrel with scary mouth monster.
Yeah, so oftentimes our names at the beginning will be something I literally wrote in our book today, Evil Big Fly.
Yes.
That's not going to be what it's called.
But that's a really succinct articulation of your goal.
Yeah.
And so sometimes just naming the monster like a really incoherent but descriptive thing. Like we also have crazy surgery monster with the baby Bjorn.
Baby Bjorn, yeah. I have one right now called the Huck Frog. I don't know what it is. It's a frog that throws things. I'll figure it out later.
Yeah. Teleporting kidnap demon. And a strange bone thing with wings.
Yeah.
So sometimes that's all it is, and that's what the design document is named, and then eventually by the end of the process, you'll have a name. But it's come up with a temporary name that is evocative, that stokes your imagination. It helps.
What's great, though, is sometimes those names do stick. I remember that we actually made one called the Sewer Thing, and we didn't know what it was. We were like, I don't know, something in the sewer. And by the time I finished writing it, I'm like, I want this thing to be called the Sewer Thing. It's great. So sometimes the name sticks, sometimes it doesn't. After all of that, you're going to start your research phase. And the research phase, probably the most important part to start with, is looking through your monster books. This might be something that you want to do even during your initial brainstorming. The reason being is that sometimes the monster that you're thinking is wholly unique already exists out there. And if the last thing you want is to go through the entire design process of homebrewing a monster just to find out that it's 99% the same as a roper. You probably could have just grabbed the roper and named it something different and made a couple tweaks and reflavored it, and you got a brand new monster. Save yourself the trouble by knowing what monsters are already out there, and that's probably the first part of your research.
And there's more than just the official books as well. We love the Monster Manual, Volo's Guide to Monsters, Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, and all the subsequent books that Wizards has put out. But the third-party publishing out there is really stepping up its game. Creature Codex and Tome of Beasts by Kobold Press are amazing and jam-packed with tons of monsters. There was the Grim Hollow Monster Grimoire by Ghostfire Gaming, who's our publisher, as well as MCDM's amazing Flea Mortals. All of these monster books and many, many more are great resources for you to look through, in particular because if you are a home dungeon master and your time is at a premium, sometimes it might be better for your time to look through an existing monster book and just grab something off the shelf rather than going through the process of homebrewing. But homebrewing is a lot of fun, and you should do it. And knowing what's out there is going to give you a lexicon of a bunch of different creatures that already exist. One of the things that I'm also going to say is encouraging is it's okay for you to make your own take on a similar idea. The official D&D books are not the last word on what a red dragon does. No matter how many cool new goblins Matt Colville and company made in Flea Mortals, there's always room for another cool goblin. And so you don't need to be dissuaded by the fact that somebody's already explored an idea to explore it on your own. you're going to have your own unique take on whatever that concept is. And nobody can own imagination, right? So nobody owns the idea of a dragon. Nobody owns the idea of a monster. Nobody owns the idea of a troll. So you can always make your own take on an existing monster, because maybe you read the stat blocks and are like, actually, I think this execution doesn't speak to me.
It can be as simple, and this is where homebrewing can come in its lightest form and simplest form. Maybe you like the troll stat block. You like that it regenerates. You like the amount of hit points it has, the amount of damage it does. And you take that troll and you give it fire powers and make a magma troll. Wink, that might be coming in our book. So it's as simple as saying, well, what if a troll was on fire and fire damage didn't hurt it? And now your players need to figure out a different damage type because it's a different type of troll. It's a troll that lives in volcanoes.
And that's where the research phase also can give you more inspiration, because you can see monsters that were created by others and be like, actually, I'm inspired by this and I want to riff off that idea in particular, or explore a similar niche to this monster, but in a very different way in execution. At the same time, it also gives you really useful benchmarks for understanding what monsters of different challenge ratings, creature types, sizes, and different types of lore do. What are their abilities? What do you like about them? What would you change? Again, is reflavoring possible? Having this reference point of what other monsters are out there is also useful in designing your own, because you know, okay, this is about the scope of what a challenge rating 6 monster does. This is what we can do at challenge rating 20. Yeah, a lot of monsters that are under challenge rating 1 are pretty short and sweet. So having that understanding is really helpful when you're actually going into the nuts and bolts work. If you're making a 2,000 word stat block for a challenge rating 1 monster, you might want to rethink that one.
I also think that it's very valuable to know that there are certain parts of homebrewing a monster that are kind of set in stone, such as you're going to be making ability scores for it. You're going to be describing whether it has any skills, saving throws. All of these elements near the top of the stat block are kind of just fill in the blanks with your stats.
Yeah.
And the easiest way for me that I've found to do that is I already have the idea and the goal of the monster. And if I have an idea of the CR, I will open 4 to 5 tabs on my computer from D&D Beyond of monsters that are of the same CR, probably similar size, but I might have 1 or 2 that are different sizes, and maybe a few that are 1 or 2 higher CR that kind of capture a similar wheelhouse. An example, if I'm making a monster who is a hunter that has a deadly bow that is CR3, I might open up the archer stat block and kind of get a grasp on, well, what are the stats of the archer? What is the general look of how many hit points it has as a CR3 ranged combatant? I might open up a few other stat blocks of maybe the gnoll or a few goblins and kind of just get an idea on what these monsters look and feel like, and kind of figure out where my stats will land based on that.
Or just find the dragon or giant that corresponds to the CR that you're making, because generally speaking, like, those represent some of the biggest archetypes, broad archetypes that you find in monsters. And there's practically a dragon for every challenge rating. And so it gives you that kind of archetype of big lizard, high AC, lots of hit points, also flies, has an AoE attack. And so you can kind of compare where your monster is to what it already exists. And it can be really helpful in figuring out, oh yeah, I need to make sure that my monster has this kind of con score or this many hit points or this AC, because wow, I was thinking that 50 hit points was going to be enough, but everything else at this challenge rating has 200.
And that's actually a valuable lesson. Now you can play around with that. If you're looking at the archer and you say, well, I want my creature to have higher AC but less hit points, that's fine. You don't have to make things exact.
Yeah.
But it's about the comparison and making sure you're falling into the spectrum, which is why I think it's good to have multiple stat blocks.
Yes. Yeah.
And kind of, again, you're doing your research.
Yeah, you can't just copy paste off one stat block of the same CR. It's really important to look at a couple different, because there's always going to be a variation within the same challenge rating. We'll come back to the problem of challenge rating in a little bit, but it really does help. And so this is where we bridge into the development phase. And I would say that for Kelly and I, a lot of our our early stages of our development, our prototype phase, is what I would consider the Frankenstein method. Because even as you build your own unique idea, there's always a level of borrowing concepts, of building off of existing ideas, and injecting your own ideas on top of that. And there is a template behind the monster. As Kelly mentioned earlier, every monster has ability scores, saving throws, skills. They have their hit points, their AC. Every monster is going to follow the format of their traits, their actions, their bonus actions, and reactions, if they have them. And the rule books actually give us, even in the Dungeon Master's Guide on page 180 and 181, is a table of standardized monster traits. And even within the monster stat blocks, there's kind of a standard pool of attacks and abilities that you want to draw on as a template. So, for example, a breath weapon. If your monster has a breath weapon, how is a breath weapon written out in a dragon stat block? If your monster has spell casting, what does the spell casting trait look like on another monster? If your monster has regeneration or magic resistance, those are all templates that you can start stitching out of one monster and sewing together your Frankenstein.
I think it's also really important to note that copying and pasting is allowed here to a degree. The vocabulary used in a lot of monster stat blocks is something that you actually want to keep consistent. So if you're designing a creature with a breath weapon, you don't want to be like, well, I don't want it to be the same as a dragon. I'm going to write the breath weapon from scratch and make it sound different. You actually want it to read the exact same as other breath weapons so that a player or a DM who's running your monster understands how to use it. And I think that a lot of abilities you can copy, paste it onto your stat block, and then fine-tune the numbers, and obviously erase dragon and put whatever your monster
No
needs.
one's rewriting the magic resistance trait wording.
No.
Right? So,
if your monster has magic resistance, just copy and paste magic resistance.
Yeah, you can. Certainly, if you're homebrewing for yourself, for your own home games, or things that you just want to share on Reddit or online or on Discord, it's fine. Certainly, if your intent is to publish this on the Dungeon Masters Guild or independently, there's going to be a point where you're going to want to really make sure that you have built something that is original and that is developed enough. But we're not there yet. We're still in the conceptual phase where we're doing this act of rapid prototyping, where we're pulling pieces together to see what could work. And if you do have the goal, like us, of publishing your work, there's going to be this phase where you do have to go through, and a lot of other RPG designers have talked about this. There's always going to be this phase where you file the serial numbers off and you turn this hodgepodge of cobbled together ideas into the unique and original thing that you're putting out into the world. Kind of that idea of, I like to think about it as taking the stitches out of the Frankenstein monster.
And remember, if you are using an ability that is in the SRD, and if it is in the Dungeon Master section on the standardized abilities that you can give monsters, then you don't need to worry too much about using those. What you do want to make sure of in your development, though, is that you are giving your monster something that makes it stand out and makes it unique. Oftentimes, Monty and I will look at the monster, think about what we want it to do, look at abilities that kind of do part of what we wanted it to do, and oftentimes Monty and I will come up with a new ability that has never been seen before in D&D just by tweaking a few words, using the mechanical language that exists, but melding it into something wholly original.
We like to push the envelope a little bit. Kelly and I are big fans of abilities that hit automatically, abilities that don't have saving throws attached to them, abilities that kind of play around with what the envelope is. We both really like, we personally feel that like a lot of monster stat blocks are just bags of hit points, and a lot of monster scary abilities are just either stunning the player characters or giving the players disadvantage on something. And so we like to avoid those types of abilities. I just find in general, I like to avoid anything that stuns the players because it's rarely fun.
Yeah.
And so this is where that your design sense is going to come into play. Beyond the monster's abilities, the table on page 274 is also going to give you some guidelines for establishing the monster's AC, hit points, saving throws, attack bonus, and damage. It's not perfect, requires some adjustment, but it helps a lot, especially when you're comparing things to other monsters.
Now, we've talked a lot about challenge rating, and we actually did a separate video on challenge rating being broken in 5th edition. You can check that out up over there. But the thing with challenge rating, it's kind of a meme that challenge rating is broken. It doesn't work very well. If you have a CR 13 monster, your 13th level characters are going to absolutely demolish it. But when you're designing a monster, especially for publication, you're not trying to reinvent the wheel when it comes to challenge rating. Just because we know that CR 13 monsters can get absolutely destroyed by 13th level characters, you still want your CR 13 monster to be as powerful and fall in the same realm as other CR 13 monsters.
This way, dungeon masters can know that your challenge rating 13 monster is probably like other challenge rating 13 monsters and is probably a better challenge as a solo monster for, say, a level 8 to 10 party than necessarily like a one-on-one versus a level 13 party.
In a weird way, there's consistency in the brokenness of CR.
Yeah.
Once you've learned that, oh, this is a monster of CR 8, I can put this up against my 4 level 6 characters and they're going to be fine. You kind of already know that in your head. I'm always throwing monsters at my party that are a few CRs above their level, sometimes 5 or 6 CRs above their level for epic boss battles. And I know that, so I would not be ready to see a homebrewed CR 8 monster, throw it against my level 5 party, and realize, oh man, this is way more powerful than the other CR 8 monsters out there.
Because even though challenge rating is broken, people still use it as a rough guideline, and I kind of like to think about it as a rough power ranking against other monsters. And that, in that way, it's still a useful reference tool. In general, a challenge rating 10 monster is still stronger than a challenge rating 8, 7 monster. There's exceptions. But in general, that's true. And so if you're making a monster that's challenge rating 13, but really it stands toe to toe with a monster that's challenge rating 20, it's challenge rating 20.
Now, when it comes to homebrewing your monster, we need to talk about the complexity of your monster. It's very tempting to throw all of the cool abilities into your homebrew monster. But I, as a DM, and I'm sure a lot of you out there, find that when I'm running a monster at the table, I forget some of their abilities if there's too many. I'm focusing on the attacks, maybe what some of their defensive traits are, and I tend to look back afterwards and say, oh, I totally forgot that they have an aura that I didn't use.
Yeah.
This has to do with the complexity of the monster, and keep in mind that your monster's only going to last 3 to 5 rounds in combat, and they don't need abilities that are going to go beyond those 3 to 5 rounds. They're only going to get to make 3 to 5 attacks. They're only going to get to do 3 to 5 cool things. If they have a reaction, they get to do that maybe a few times. So keep that in mind when you're designing your monster. Don't throw everything in the kitchen sink into your single monster. You can make a bunch of monsters with cool abilities.
So in general, I like to practice a bit of economy with my monsters. I find that a monster benefits from having a really solid basic attack. And the basic attack of a monster should be something that they actually have a reason to use. It shouldn't be there as like the thing that they do when they have nothing else to do. No, make the basic attack something cool. Make it worthwhile. And then you might want to give your monster 1 to 3 of the following. A big opening move that it can do to create tension. A combo move of some kind that it can use under specific circumstances, for example, against a prone enemy or a restrained enemy to like escalate the circumstances. That kind of tells a story with it. And then having a bit of a finishing move or a final move of some kind that it does to really scare the pants off the player characters.
I mean, your finishing move, other than scaring the pants off the players, could also be this monster is stuck in a corner situation and has that one cool thing that it can do to turn the tides of the battle back in its favor. But choosing one of those is a good way to go. Again, That depends on the CR of the monster, I think. You might have 2 of them for higher ranked monsters.
Yeah, and in general, you want to be very careful about giving a monster more than one of the following. Now, a monster could have all of these, but giving them more than one is careful. So, like, 1 bonus action and 1 reaction is fine. Giving a monster 1 recharge ability is usually fine, and 1 sort of once per day power is usually fine. You want to be careful about giving a monster several different bonus actions or several different reactions, because that can make it a little more complex to run. Again, you might have an exception here if you're making a boss monster. But if you're making a minion or a rank and file monster or a standard monster, I pretty much view these as hard limits, except for boss monsters. Again, maybe you've got a really creative idea, so don't be dissuaded from that. But it is one of those things where I think our good friend Sean Merwin said, like, if it's got more powers than its proficiency bonus, it might be too complicated for like a standard level monster.
And I think that's important to keep in mind that a lot of what we've just discussed, if you're making a CR1 monster, it doesn't necessarily need a bonus action or reaction. Maybe one of those. It needs a standard attack and maybe 1 trait.
Yeah.
It doesn't need much more than that. If you're now up to CR5 or 6, you might throw in the bonus action, the reaction, 2 to 3 traits, and 1 or 2 cool attacks. And then as you go up, it increases. You keep that in mind that if you're making a CR1 monster that has a bonus action, a reaction, 3 different attacks, a recharge ability, and 4 traits, that's not a CR1 monster.
Because ultimately, a factor that we don't see discussed a lot in monster design is how much mental load does the dungeon master have to apply to run this monster? There's some beautifully complicated monsters out there. I played a lot of 4th edition, and it has a lot of really, really slick, well-designed monsters. And those monsters would be super cool if a computer was running them. But I'm not a computer, I'm a person. And you got to remember that, like, a dungeon, especially when you got a monster that is meant to be used as part of a group, like, there used to be this whole 4th edition design philosophy where you would design an encounter with monsters like you were making a mini group of PCs, where you would have 4 different monsters and all of them had 6 different abilities. And now, as a dungeon master, you are running 4 monsters that between them have 30 different abilities that you need to keep track of. That's a lot. And so I think that this element of, like, yes, we want interesting monsters, but how complicated are, like, at what point have they become too complicated?
One thing that I really like to do in my design principle is if I'm making minions, it usually means that I'm also designing a bigger, scarier monster to go with the minions. And what I'll often do is I will give the minions a very basic stat block that has 1 cool thing that it does. For example, maybe my minions all have the ability when they hit with an attack to push a target 5 feet. My big, scary monster has an AoE ability that it can set up that all the minions are now pushing the enemies into. By doing this, what I've actually done is made very simple minions that have 1 cool thing that they do. And then I've amplified that by pairing it with the other monster that I'm creating.
I like to think of it is that with monsters, sometimes you need the starch that is the delivery vehicle for the gravy.
Yeah.
Right? And so it is okay. Like, well, there is this criticism of the monsters that are just a bag of hit points. The flip side of monsters that are these crazy Rube Goldberg machines, those require a lot of mental brain processing power for a DM to run. And so there is a little bit of a back and forth between these sorts of things. Our layout editor, Martin Hughes, sat Kelly and I down when we started our writing process for Monsters of Drakkenheim. And one of the things that he actually told us that was really, really useful was what our target word count is for a stat block. And generally speaking, when you look at on a page in a book, a monster stat block that takes up a quarter page, which is usually good for like a minion type monster or less, is about 200 words. Whereas your standard monster stat block might be about 400. And as soon as a monster stat block gets into the 500, 600 to 800 word range, you're soundly in boss monster territory. And so if I have seen homebrew monsters where I've seen a monster that is intended to be like a rank and file monster that is 1,000 words. And that is too much. So evaluate, and this is why your goals are important. Because if you're making a boss monster, you can kind of break all the rules. But if your goal is that standard rank and file type monster, you want to be a little bit more constrained with how many powers you give it.
Finally, we come to the last stage of your monster making journey, and that is testing it out. You've designed the monster. You might not be done designing the monster because testing it out is going to teach you a lot about how the monster actually works.
Totally. And you might have noticed that we haven't talked too much about the numbers because in our experience, there's only so much you can do with the numbers of how much damage a monster does, what its AC needs to be, what its saving throws need to be, and how much hit points it has. There's only so much that you can do on paper there. That's where the best you can kind of shoot for is examining other monsters and approximating where those lie. But ultimately, we find that anything that we write for a number on a monster entry is entirely theoretical until it actually sees play.
And this is where the numbers are going to change the most, is when you're actually testing it out. Now, maybe you're designing a monster because you want to surprise your players with it, give them something that they've never seen before, in which case playtesting the monster with your players is going to ruin that surprise.
You could playtest it on your own and run a simulation encounter, but there's a few other options that you have for playtesting your monsters without spoiling the surprise for your players.
There's a lot of online formats to get in touch with other people looking to play. If you have any other friend DMs who are out there that might want to jump in for a monster jam session where everybody kind of gets to try taking on the monster and giving you feedback on it, if there's lots of communities out there. I know our Discord, for example, has a lot of people that get together to discuss homebrewing and jumping into games together to test their homebrew. So a lot of communities out there for you to try these out. And in trying it out, another thing that I want to say is that it's okay to adapt on the fly the first time you're running the monster. I generally, if I'm playtesting a monster, have a notepad sitting there and I might change something on the fly. I might hit a character twice and realize that I've knocked them down to 1 hit point and that wasn't what this monster was supposed to do. And I might write down lower their damage output and I might on the spot lower it. Maybe I think that the battle's going on too long, so I quickly strike a few of their hit points off. Or they reduced the monster to 0 hit points in the first round before it got to do anything, and this is supposed to be a tough battle. I might raise the hit points. Making these adjustments on the fly is okay during your playtest, and then take notes to make sure that you can adjust afterwards to something that suits your needs more.
Here's my format for a Monster Mash playtest. Get 5 Dungeon Masters together. Each of you makes a monster. And then you have 4 player characters. A standard thief rogue, an evoker wizard, a champion fighter, and a life domain cleric. And make sure that you've got these pre-gen characters at various levels. Each of you takes your monster, pass it to the DM on the left. Another DM runs your monster while you fight it, probably playing the fighter. And generally because you've got the least capacity as the champion fighter to really muck with the monster. As long as you're not behind the wizard or the cleric, I think you probably don't have the key to just immediately annihilating it. And then you run that encounter, and then each of the DMs, you just rotate each encounter. And so you run someone else's monster. And this format of playtesting monsters, you get to do 5 monsters this way, right? And you get to see how a lot of different people play. And it's something that, depending on the complexity of the monsters, if you're all doing like pretty simple monsters, you can actually probably all do them all in 1, 2, or 3 hour session. Whereas you might need to meet a couple times for more complex ones. But this kind of design jam, or I like to call it a monster mash, it's really cool and it's easy to get off the ground. There's a lot of people that are eager to share their monsters. And I'm just going to say that like the monster mash is not something that I see happening enough. And I think it's a great way. It's one of the easiest ways to play more games and try more monsters out.
It's also interesting because something that happens, and there's almost no way to avoid this, is that when you write the monster, you're doing a lot of mental work yourself. You already know what this monster's tactics are. You know how you want to combine the different moves together. You know everything that you want this monster to do. So when you run it, you know all of that. There's actually a lot of stuff that isn't on the page that you have up here, and there's no way to avoid that. As soon as you hand the monster to another DM, you get to see if they can read the monster stat block and pick up on its tactics just from glancing at it.
Yeah.
And if they can, that's extremely valuable.
And the only other thing that I'll note is when you are running playtests is it is really handy to use the bare bones vanilla subclasses because you want the playtest to be focused on the monster. If you go into a playtest where the monster has to survive against a min-maxed character build, you're not really going to see what the monster does because a min-maxed character build is going to annihilate anything. And so your goal in designing a monster should never be a monster that can challenge a min-maxed character because that's an arm race the monsters are pretty much always going to lose. The way that monsters win that is by the monster being a way higher challenge rating than the min-maxed character. And at that point, like, it's just math, right? So I like to say when I am playtesting monsters, I ask people, don't make the DPS kings that are going to kill the monster in one round. Like, bring us the reasonable damage. And I also ask, don't bring spells like Banishment, Hold Monster, Hypnotic Pattern, Avoid Monks with Stunning Strike, because any monster is gonna struggle with those sorts of mechanics. And while there are things like legendary resistances and immunities that help with those things, if you go into a playtest and try to endure those abilities, the monster's not going to... You need to see the monster doing its thing.
Yeah, if you design a really cool monster and your goal is to playtest it and on the first round it gets banished, then you don't get to playtest it.
Yeah.
Yes, that was a cool way to outdo the encounter, and hopefully in a real game the players have that equipped so that they can undo the monster, but that wasn't the point. You want to know what this monster can actually do when it gets a few rounds in.
Yeah, and in general, I also feel that you want to avoid that kind of arms race style design with monsters. Like, it's really easy to just say a monster can't be stunned and the monster's immune to being banished or has some sort of way to counteract those abilities. And I generally find that, like, those are kind of problems that you need to solve in ways around the monster design. Like, you can't, unless you have a very specific goal of, like, if you want to make a monster that can't be banished, then just make a monster that can't be banished, right? My final note that I'll say is that the chapter on making a monster in the original Dungeon Master's Guide is actually really good. And it does have a lot of good nuts and bolts advice that, as I've been designing more monsters, I find increasingly that the tables there and the advice there are actually pretty on point. And my conversations with other designers have generally confirmed this belief that it is pretty handy at dialing in the numbers, at least as you go into playtesting, but the playtesting is where they're going to get refined.
I hope that these tips were helpful and that if you are setting out to homebrew monsters, there's a world of possibilities out there. And even with the thousands of monsters that we have out there, the fact is that there will never be enough monsters, and there's always cool gaps for your imagination to fill.
The nightmares will never end.
Even if the gap is this big, if you have a monster, two monsters that are very similar, but you think of a third cooler idea that fits right in the middle, make it. There's no problem there.
We're never going to have too many trolls. We're never going to have too many goblins. There's never going to be too many dragons. There's never going to be too many evil wizards or insane cultists. And I love seeing every interpretation of zombies under the sun and in the dark of the night. The monsters and myths are a constant building on top of the things that scare us, the things that terrify us, the monsters of our imagination. And of course, the thing at the end of the day is that there will never be a deadlier or scarier monster than humanity. Well, maybe except for Cthulhu. But even then, the real monsters are
the real monsters were in us all along. I think what's important here is no matter what, have fun making stuff.
Yeah.
That's it. Have fun making stuff. Homebrewing is great.
Yeah. Really, when it comes to monster design more than anything else, because monsters are ultimately there to get killed, they're kind of disposable in the way that we design them. And so the scope and space for monsters, especially in 5th edition, is far less precise than if you were, say, building a subclass or a class. And so I find it's one of the funnest places to homebrew because the creativity really gets to take control here. And yes, balance is important, but the fun thing about D&D 5e is that it's only kind of sort of balanced. So it gives you this room, maybe not at all. And so it gives you this room to do interesting things and break the rules and try things out, and do the unexpected. And that's why I love making monsters for 5th edition, because it's so open-ended, the scope that you can take with what they are, what their story is.
If you've done any homebrewing and made some awesome monsters, tell us about your favorite one in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters, as well as our amazing Kickstarter backers. Monsters of Drakkenheim is now on Kickstarter. If you want to support us, you want to support our channel, you want to support our writing, there's so many ways that you can do that, and we appreciate every single way that you can. Whether you grab on our Patreon or grab our Kickstarter, the links are all down below.
And if you want to see us play testing some of these monsters, we're currently doing an arc in our actual play in the Worlds of Drakkenheim where we are seeing a bunch of the monsters from our new book. You can check out all of those episodes right up over here.
And we got plenty more advice for you on homebrewing for your games with D&D 5e right up over here.
Please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
in the dungeon.